Welcome to DeProgram. I'm Michelle Witte. I'm here with Ted Rall and John Kiriakou, and we are joined by Aaron Good. Aaron is a political scientist, and he's hosted the American Exception podcast on Patreon and the author of American Exception, Empire and the Deep State. He's joining us for the show today. Thanks for being here, Aaron.
Well, thank you. My pleasure.
We have a bunch of consequential things happening in just the last couple of days. We are going to talk about this ceasefire deal that was announced a few days ago by Joe Biden between Israel and the Palestinian armed resistance. I have some words for Joe Biden about his farewell address and warning, because the irony in that speech really blew my mind. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the administration on its way out delisting Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terror, which is great, which I welcome, but which, I think itself reveals how arbitrary or purely punitive that list is right now. And then just today, we have the Supreme Court upholding the act of Congress that would ban or force the sale of TikTok in the United States. And I think, Ted, you have some thoughts on that. So yeah, that's, I think, what we're hoping to get into.
Good. Welcome, Aaron. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you.
Let's start with the ceasefire. Since Joe Biden announced it, everyone talking about it has been on tenterhooks and has been, issuing analysis and predictions that are full of little asterisks, because we have seen ceasefires fall apart before, and we have seen, in fact, this specific ceasefire fall apart before. But as of the last hour, it seems to still be a going concern, right? The security cabinet in Israel had passed it. The full cabinet was voting on it as of a couple hours ago. I have not seen any results of that, but I'm also, tell me if I'm wrong, guys, but I'm not seeing anybody predict that this is not going to pass or that it's dead in the water. And so with that kind of out of the way, I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. Joe Biden announced on January 15th that Israel and Hamas had come to a ceasefire deal. And as he made that announcement, he repeatedly informed us that this was the same deal his administration had helped to hammer out in May, as though that reflects favorably upon the Biden administration and not upon the incoming Trump administration, who I think everyone whose name is not Joe Biden or Karine Jean-Pierre or Antony Blinken is actually giving credit for prodding Israel to stick to the plan, at least so far, right? Joe Biden, as far as I'm concerned, might as well have stood up and taken personal credit for every death that has occurred between May and January 15th, which is really disgusting. And I want to, I'm curious what all of your perceptions are as to what the Trump and Biden teams actually contributed to this deal. But I also wanted to talk about what is moving behind the scenes here, right? Because of course you can talk about what Biden's team is doing and what Trump's team is doing, but if this country was actually run by elected figures acting on the expressed will of the people, I think we would live in a very different country. And so I noticed, Aaron, that you wrote on Twitter a couple of days ago that, if Trump indeed compels Bibi Netanyahu to end the Gaza genocide, it would suggest that he plans to scapegoat Netanyahu for all of this, which points to U.S. deep politics. And you said, in this moment of instability, U.S. politics is like a conflict between warring mobs. And I'm very curious, what sides you sketch out here, right? Which sides of the mobs that actually control American decision-making have decided that this instability in the Middle East is not actually good for us, and which ones are still hanging on to it?
Well, this is a question that we could answer with, greater or lesser complexity And I think at the core of this is the issue of why the U.S. and Israel have become so intertwined in recent decades, especially in the 21st century. And I believe that it does take us into the realm of deep politics or the politics of the very top of the political system that isn't really about elections. It's really about very extremely wealthy oligarchs. I mean, this is an oligarchy of private wealth, and to the the real factions are organized groups of oligarchs commanding huge amounts of money in large organizations like corporations, think tanks, and everything else that they control. And these are the people who were able to move the U.S. to decide to push for global empire after World War II. And then they've had different conflicts among them, and the intelligence agencies and the Pentagon and elected officials sort of operate at the pleasure of these different oligarchs. And we all kind of understand that the wealthy sort of control everything, but we're not, the mechanisms of this we might disagree on. But if you look at the state of Israel, it was controversial at the time to recognize it, 1948, and Harry Truman does so, and he's also given a big campaign contribution that helps him win in 1948 from Zionist backers. So he's kind of beholden to the Israel lobby, like in the way we think of AIPAC now. And the Democrats were more, I think that at that time, the Democrats were the party that was actually more favorable to Israel, and other people like old oil people, Rockefellers and such, they were actually a little bit, they weren't necessarily in favor of it for a number of reasons. They actually thought it might make it more difficult for them to have control over the Middle Eastern oil like they wanted. So when Eisenhower comes to office, he comes to office on a wave of oil cash. And in 1956, you have the Suez Crisis, which was basically a land grab from Israel, backed by some other Western powers like the Brits and the French. But in 1956, the U.S. says, no, no, we're gonna put the kibosh on this. You're not gonna take over all this land and go after this. It'll make us seem like another white imperial power to the rest of the world, and we're trying to make the rest of the world think that we have a better system than communism. So 1956, it doesn't work. But in 1967, you have Lyndon Johnson in the White House, and it's kind of a repeat, really. It's just another scheme by Zionists, the Zionist West, to start a war and grab more land. And they get away with it this time. LBJ is basically a more corruptible person than Eisenhower, or he just serves different people. So Eisenhower served, Standard Oil, Sullivan and Cromwell type corporate titans of the old Eastern Anglo establishment. And the Democrats, like Harry Truman and like LBJ, they're tied into, they have more Zionist backers. And it seems to be, I've come to believe it's related to labor and labor corruption. And as much as people don't like to think about this, organized crime in the United States. We have a make-believe view of organized crime from movies and such as this Italian thing, but really Meyer Lansky was the top mobster, and he was the mob's accountant, and he understood the gambling rackets in all the major localities. And the Teamster corruption allowed them to use Teamster pension funds to build casinos in Las Vegas and so on, and launder all this drug money. And that drug money goes into the so-called legitimate economy. And it's just, I think that we have a more mobbed up country than anybody ever realized. And the Israeli part of it is a part of that story that nobody's ever really sussed out. And I've been trying to work on this of late. And the more that I look into it, the more evidence I find of this. And I think that really what happens is, and I'm sorry if this is a longer answer or more complex than anybody wanted to go and revisit history, but it over time, this sort of corrupt, warlike, the neocons before the neocons, they are able to gain more power in society, and they sort of change the composition of the oligarchy such that that old guard that held together in 1956 to stop the Suez crisis, like they eventually diminish in power, and for whatever reason, they become more pro-Zionist and neocon in their orientation. And there's a bit of pushback from different people. Nixon had some different, plans about how to handle these things. And Reagan, at one point at the end of his presidency, he recognizes the PLO. And H.W. Bush actually forces Israel to enter into negotiations for a Palestinian state. And the Zionists really freaked out on him, and the neocons were H.W. Bush's enemy. And I believe that's why he lost in 92, because if you think about it, they just ended the Cold War and he'd won in the Gulf War. He should have cruised to victory, a re-election by the conventions of American politics. Usually incumbents win, and he had presided over like some very flag-waving moments of victory over the bad guy Saddam and
Mm.
defeating the Soviet Union, but he loses. And I
Well,
believe that it was
that's
the
the Ross
Israel lobby
Perot
that did
factor,
that.
though. But that's the Ross Perot factor. Did Ross Perot have any ties to Israel?
Well, it's funny that you say that because I'd been looking at this, and during H.W. Bush's presidency, the neocons wrote this crazy manifesto, Wolfowitz especially in the Pentagon and probably at Cheney's behest. He wrote this crazy manifesto about how we need to like basically preemptively destroy any country that could threaten U.S. domination now that the Soviet Union has fallen, right? And H.W. Bush said, these guys are the crazies. Like, I'm not going to listen to this. And they leaked it to the press, and it was kind of a scandal, right? And this is in 91. Now, Perot runs in 92. And what you were saying about Perot, it made me go back and try to look into Perot. And I didn't look very deeply. It actually just sort of, one part of it fell into my lap, which was I was looking at Iraq and how for different reasons, the Israel lobby especially benefited from this Iraq invasion. And then years later, you have this situation where in Kurdistan, all the oil is being basically pumped through Turkey, and they're stealing oil and they're stealing Syrian oil, and it ends up going out to a port in Turkey and then over to shipped to Israel. So like they're basically getting oil, stolen oil from Kurdistan and so on. And the one company that was operating there, the American company operating in Kurdistan, getting all of this oil for Israel was Ross Perot Jr. So to me, that's a very interesting aspect of this. But I think my Ross Perot, I would suspect that he ultimately ran nudged by these forces. And it's not merely Zionists that I'm talking about. It's a whole constellation of American hawks and other people that benefit from this ultra militaristic foreign policy. So it's like people like the Texas oil people like what became the military industrial complex, that it has been log-rolled into this coalition, and that when W. Bush runs in 2000, uh, according to an oil executive, and then later somebody who worked in the oil ministry that I spoke to named Gary Vogler, he was friendly with an Exxon executive who knew the Bush family, and the Bush and was in touch with Barbara Bush, and according to her, the reason that H.W. Bush thought he lost in 92 was because of the Israel lobby, and that W wasn't going to make that same mistake.
Let me
And
interrupt you on that point right there. Um, the Emir of Bahrain, the king of Bahrain, when I was serving in Bahrain, said publicly that George H.W. Bush was the only president since Eisenhower to give the Arabs a fair shake, that he had stood up to the Israelis and that he paid the price. So I think your analysis is 100% correct. And Middle Eastern leaders are willing to come out and say it.
Mm.
and so that's interesting. I hadn't heard that about that particular leader, but there are times still, even in the 21st century, where the neocons, and the Greater Israel ultra Zionists were too crazy for even extra crazy what they were trying to do, and it was obvious that it was not in the U.S. national interest, and you have pushback. So you had some stories coming out in like 2005. Dennis Hastert gets written up in Vanity Fair about how he's taking cash heroin money from the Turkish lobby, which if you look at who it was comprised of was largely people like people who are associated with the Israel lobby, basically like people like Richard Pearl, for example, right? And she's basically this whistleblower in the FBI was given space in a major publication to get into the clandestine side of things, right? And that seems to me like a way to kind of push back against the neocons. I even think John's torture story was an example of this. Like, however John found himself in that position, I think someone wanted to wrong foot the push for more war, and to damage the global war on terror effort in some way. I suspect that John was a pawn in that kind of a thing. Additionally, in 2007, you had Brzezinski go in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and say, people, we're in great danger. We're
Yeah.
at a risk of a catastrophic war against Iran. There's going to be, there's likely to be a terror attack, and it'll be blamed on Iran, and it will lead to the U.S. launching a war that'll be a disaster for the region and for the global economy and for the U.S. Right? I mean, he was basically saying they're going to stage an attack so that they can launch a war against Iran, and that's Brzezinski, who's an imperialist, very much so. Additionally, you have times where, like Obama, where he wouldn't go into Syria, for example, even though there was a lot of pressure for him to do so.
Mm.
So I feel that there's pushback from elements of the U.S. that are still responsive to like a rational conception of the national interest, but they have to be pretty crazy to get to that point. And in a strange way, I think that my hope is that Trump and the people who are advising him on this are aware of this and they realize how precarious the US position is because of what we've done in the 20th century, 21st century, and that because it's so obviously self-defeating to go on like this, and they would just further delegitimize the US and Israel by continuing the Gaza genocide, they may make Netanyahu the sort of fall guy for something that is much deeper than Netanyahu. I mean, I think that people like Ben Gurion, for example, were just not that different than Netanyahu,
Mm.
except in their public persona. Like they ultimately wanted the same thing. It's why Israel never could declare its borders, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that Zionism at the top of it's the deep politics of Zionism, the sort of opaque apex of power in Zionism is essentially fascistic and aggressively expansionist and imperialistic. And we hate to say it, but like ideologically, it resembles nothing so much as that infamous German regime that we are taught about in school.
I do feel like
Aaron,
we've answered this without asking it, but just to give Ted and John, none of you want to come out and argue that this was the Biden administration's achievement and not the achievement of Donald Trump and his real estate magnate Middle East advisor.
well, first of all, before we get to that, I just want to point. I mean, Aaron, some people who are watching this we're going to listen to what you just said and be like, wow, that sounds a little bit like you're skirting close to some anti-Semitic rhetoric there, right? Like, you're talking about the dark, like everything related to Zionism is cloaked in secrecy and behind. I mean, it doesn't mean it's not true, but that's like viewed as an anti-Semitic trope. I just want to give you a chance to address that.
Sure. I mean, if you look at the actions of Mossad, for example, in 1963, they task a former Nazi terrorist and assassin with murdering a Egyptian scientist who's a German, but he's gone to Egypt, but he's working on rocket technology for NASA, and they just straight up murder him. But they have a Nazi do it for them. So this is the clandestine world.
Mm.
These are people who do commit crimes in secrecy. And my take on the U.S. is very similar. The U.S. clandestine state is similar, except what it's trying to do is a little less intense than what the Zionists have been attempting to do. Like they do not have a blood and soil fascist project,
Mm.
and they don't have a sort of metaphysical, magical conception from the book of Joshua that they're trying to fulfill. They don't talk about the seed of Amalek. I think that they just want mostly corporate profits in perpetuity. And so they're rational in that sort of way, but they're absolutely the empire that has dominated and killed more people than probably any other empire if you look at the structural effects of the economic order that we impose. So I think that Israel and the U.S. both have regimes that operate secretly and whose real objectives are not stated, and they're both utterly criminal. And the world is saddled with these two terrible regimes that are lawless and murderous and bent on imperialism and global dominance to the extent that they can get away with it. So I'm not really accusing the Zionists of much that I'm not accusing the U.S. of, except, they are. I think the U.S. is more covertly fascist and a bunch of, Wall Street, essentially imperialists. And then Israel represents, and there is, of course, the capitalist element, but there's also a kind of blood and soil fascism that, makes them pound for pound a bit crazier and even more dangerous than the rational evil people that run the U.S.
And just to answer your question, Michelle, no, I'm not going to say that this was Biden's doing. Obviously, Biden gets to sign it because, technically it's still his presidency for a couple more hours. But, it's we know this could have been done a long time ago. I mean, it smells a little bit like, the deal that freed the hostages in Iran in 1981. That was Reagan. It wasn't Carter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you have to wonder, like, I do think if we are arguing that rationality, right, is on Donald Trump's side here, right? More rational interests are on Trump's team pushing Israel, actually using some of the levers of power, even though he's not even in office yet, but demonstrating what Biden could have done all this time. I mean, I think it does, it does raise a question again of like, what exactly has been motivating the Biden administration? Like, was there anything, was this just an absolutely irrational embrace of I don't know, an ideology or sort of irrational entanglement with inertia? You know what I mean? Like, we simply cannot, we cannot exert any will over Israel. Yeah. Yeah, I wish I could quit you. Exactly. So if we're seeing rationality on Trump's side, like what has the Biden administration been doing all this time? And is it actually fair? I think we can get sometimes too personal and laying blame sometimes in administrations, but I don't know if that's the case here. I think maybe you can lay a lot of this personally at the feet of Joe Biden and Antony Blinken.
Yeah. I wanted to make a comment too, real quickly, if I could. What we saw over the last couple of days vis-a-vis the ceasefire in Gaza, it seemed to me had strong parallels to the Iran hostage crisis and its resolution on January 20th, 1981, right? The Iranians waited until Ronald Reagan put his right hand up in the air to take the oath of office. The hostages were released. We know historically that it was Warren Christopher and the government of Algeria that affected those negotiations. But sure, the Iranians were probably a little bit afraid of Ronald Reagan. I think the same thing happened here. I think that Netanyahu had no fear of Joe Biden at all, and that's why there was no movement on peace negotiations or ceasefire negotiations. And it's not that he's afraid of Donald Trump. He's not. It's that he believes, like so many other world leaders that we've heard from, he believes that Donald Trump is too unpredictable to roll the dice. And he might as well wrap it up now.
It's Richard Nixon's madman theory.
That is exactly right. Yes.
Or does he think that Trump is going to give him the war with Iran that he wants? Is the other question, right? Like the other, question that I hear a lot is like, what has he promised, right? That's going to make Bibi sort of appear to eat a little bit of shit that we're going to hear about in the next 6 weeks.
My gut says that's nuts. But then when you break it down person by person, you have a neocon in as the Secretary of State.
I don't know how. I really wonder I wonder how long he's going to last. I really do. And I hope it's not very long. He is kind of an exception in the cabinet now.
Rubio could be a Rex Tillerson. He could be, but he's young and he's willing to eat shit. So I think he's going to be around for at least.
This could move him over to defense.
Yeah, it could really move him over to defense. Yeah,
I think
see that.
I think it's Hegseth who's not long for this world.
Yeah, he's
Comes
just
in drunk
not
on day
qualified for the job. But I was just going to say about Hegseth, he's irrationally pro-Israel. He's a vocal Zionist. He hates Iran. So my heart wants to say, oh come on, Trump is one of these isolationists. We're not going to have to worry about a war with Iran. An Iranian friend of mine tells me that they're very much worried about war with the United States. And, with Pete Hegseth calling the shots over there and a neocon Marco Rubio at state, do we know?
It's totally insane. I have to think no one's that insane. Maybe I'm wrong.
I hope that that's right, Ted, because it's totally insane to me. I can't imagine doing it. And there would be no support nationally. If there was another 9/11, sure, you could dupe people into thinking, at least for a while, that Iran was behind it. But
Sure.
absent some kind of national catastrophe, I can't imagine going to war with Iran.
What's scary about it is that would seem to be a window of opportunity to actually have this war with Iran, because after this year, the Ukraine war is going to end, and I don't see
Yes,
how NATO makes any sense going forward for those countries.
good point.
The
It
U.S.
hasn't
has
made any
wrecked
sense since
them.
1991.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, and it's the same fundamental deal of what NATO was all about in the first place. NATO was created, and really the permanent war economy was created in around 1950, or the decision was made in order to make sure that the countries of Europe, especially, did not that they were not neutral, that they did not trade with the Soviet Union. The policymakers knew that the Soviets weren't going to invade, but they had to hype that threat to get these countries invested or in brought into this alliance so that they could have a block and they wouldn't be able to they would keep them in the dollar area that they wanted to have work the way that they wanted it to work. And
hmm
that was so NATO was always an imperialist
Hmm.
uh, gambit of sorts. And if that as that falls apart, you would wonder how long Europe will continue to support Israel as hard its leadership does, but I don't think the public does. It's just like the U.S. You had a majority wanting a halt to the Gaza genocide in the election, and yet of the three contenders before RFK dropped out, not one of them was saying that. Like, how do you get all three people to take minority positions vis-a-vis the public? I mean, that's power right there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, they've been doing that in a lot of things. I mean, for years. Free trade is probably the classic example. 80% of Americans have been against these free trade agreements like NAFTA from the very beginning, but both parties are always for them.
hmm
I'm looking at this article. I think it came out in the last couple of days. It was a review of how public opinion influences policy. I just find that it does not. It simply doesn't. It has no influence on policy, which again, could take you back to, okay, well, if we rule that out, right, and we basically rule out electoral politics, then who is making policy, right? Who is fighting over this stuff, and who is winning or losing or trading here if it doesn't influence policy at all?
hmm
Well, I mean, I want to just push back a little bit. I mean, basically, not only do I agree with that point, I've been writing and drawing and screaming that point for years. So I agree with it 100%, million percent. But there's the 0.5%. I gotta I know those numbers didn't add up.
No.
But I gotta drive the car into the driveway here. I mean, there's a little bit. I mean, so what does happen sporadically is that you'll get a spasm of voter rage. We've just seen one in the last election, where and then the powers that be, they're like, oh, we've got to throw a little bone to the people, otherwise we're going to have a revolution on our hands. And so that's the influence. It's like when there's a little spasm, whether it's a Occupy Wall Street or a Tea Party or whatever, then you might see some kind of faint. I think the best example of that in recent years was Black Lives Matter, where, for example, you had the Minneapolis City Council first promised to defund the police, and then quietly after the riots, everyone had gone back to work and the lockdown was over and BLM was being wrapped up. It's like then they rolled that back, and pretty much it's kind of like now you still have the right wingers saying, well, we defunded the police and that's why everything's crazy. It's like, well, no one defunded the police, but
No.
yeah.
I mean, are we seeing the influence of public opinion on policy in the election of Donald Trump? Actually, like that was the option for, because we are seeing also there was some recent reporting on the amount of voters who voted for, the percentage of voters who voted for Biden in 2020 who sat out, and how many of them said they were influenced by his choices on Gaza. I mean, we don't, I think
That was the top answer.
Yes, exactly. And so I think if you were somebody who was banking on Donald Trump as being a sort of peacemaker across the board, you were playing a very dangerous game there. But I think people believed him more than they believed anybody else when he said, I'm going to put an end to this Gaza conflict, and I am going to put an end to the Ukraine conflict. And they might not have been wrong to put their faith in those assertions. So maybe there was a
record to look at. I mean, I think it really cannot be overstated what a dramatic shift it was for a Republican to run as an anti-Iraq war Republican in the presidential, not in a Republican primary, and win, and then to negotiate with the Taliban and arrive at a conclusion that withdrawal was what needed to happen. And yeah, he didn't execute it himself, but the point is, those were dramatic moves. Those represent something that looks and feels like a political realignment. And at least I feel like we're seeing a 1932 scale realignment on foreign policy, not domestic policy.
Yeah, that is the issue, is that I think Trump may be answering to, is that the empire needs to retrench, and that there may be people around him who are sober enough to recognize that it has to happen, that they can't really, the more that they try to go forward and, fix the problem with military force in the Middle East or in Ukraine, it will only be more disastrous. And so you notice that Trump is really being aggressive and patriotically waving the flag like it's 1898 or something, and they're trying to fight the Spanish-American War. I mean, it's like he's talking about Greenland and the Panama Canal, and maybe people are talking about invading Mexico. Bret Stephens just wrote an op-ed saying it's time to invade Venezuela, which would get him jailed if we had the rule of law prevailed in this country, because that's brazenly illegal. You can't incite people to murder one person, much less attack a whole country illegally. But of course, it doesn't matter here in the U.S. Those laws only apply, for other people.
Yeah.
But my point is, this is like a return to the era of the Monroe Doctrine, wherein the U.S. was going to be the hegemonic over the Western Hemisphere. And perhaps this is kind of bowing to reality now. And what that means for Israel and so on down the road, I don't know. But you really can't have war with China. You can't have war with Iran. It'd be a disaster. And you can't have war with Russia. And so how do they possibly extricate themselves from this? How do they save the European economy? The Europeans are getting kicked out of, especially the French, are getting kicked out of West Africa. That's the only reason France has been as wealthy as it has been over the last many decades. It's because they just have a neo-colonial relationship with West Africa that is ending. I mean, the world is tired of white power running everything and the dollar. And so in a sense, I don't know that they're so worried about American public opinion, except for a couple things. They cannot field an army. I don't think that they could fight a ground war. Because who would be stupid enough to go and join the army and fight in whatever war Donald Trump is going to fight, or whatever Democratic president? Because nobody's going to attack the U.S. Everyone knows that these are wars for imperialism and for a class. More and more people are aware that this is just for a class of billionaires. I'm not going to go and become an amputee or get PTSD and commit suicide for some flag waving, idiocy that's not for me. Nobody feels that way anymore. And the other aspect is that we are so backward now in all of our institutions. I think that the writing's on the wall. In 20 years, China is going to be far ahead of us in every area of human progress. Well, they've already surpassed us in life expectancy. I mean, if you look at the condition of China at the end of at the time that the communists took over in 1949, what they'd been through with the Taiping uprising, which stemmed from the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion and the Japanese imperialism during World War II, but it was decades really. And then the Civil War itself. They've been through hell largely because of Western imperialism, and yet their civilization has cohered and they surpassed us in life expectancy. That's astounding. And the U.S. has nothing really to offer people, except for lies and PR.
Aaron, I wish you were right about the not being able to get cannon fodder for the next stupid fucking war. I think you're wrong. I think there's always going to be 17-year-olds who will swallow some recruiter's stupid lies. You're going to get to serve wherever you want. You're saving America. Your family will be so proud. You'll come back alive.
I mean,
you'll go to college. No,
haven't we seen headlines for the last couple of years about, it's like once or twice a year, there's a headline about one branch of the military having a recruiting crisis. So, I mean, and a lot of it it's about like obesity or, something very sad
Tattoos,
like that.
Drugs, demographics, demographics. But we're not making many kids anymore.
I mean, I think there might be multiple reasons why they are going to be struggling. I mean, at least I hope it will be a failure to convince people to join this, the cause. But I think they're going to
I
have
hope.
more than that to fight against to keep filling these ranks.
Yeah.
I guess before we move off this topic, unless you guys want to keep going, I do have a question about, that for a while, when the Democrats were still trying to get us to believe that they were working ceaselessly toward a ceasefire, there was an effort to scapegoat Benjamin Netanyahu specifically, right? Israel's great. How dare you attack Israel's right to resist? The only problem in Israel is Benjamin Netanyahu. He's a nasty guy, and we're really doing our best
We
to
need
control
regime
him.
change. Remember, they were
Yeah.
talking about that.
If I sort of wonder what you guys think is going to be Netanyahu's future, because he has his own domestic political issues in Israel that are very serious. But also, like, if Trump is going to try and do this, scapegoating Netanyahu, it does sort of set up an interesting clash of political survivors. And Netanyahu is the much longer, slipperier, more successful history, right? Like more political, he's been in politics much longer. There are more things that should have knocked him out, and he keeps coming back. But I mean, Donald Trump, on
Also,
his side, he's got the 34 felony counts and whatever all these talking points has
$500
been.
million that he still owes to Jean Carroll.
It is interesting. I mean, so far Netanyahu has come out on top when it comes to going up against U.S. presidents. And I wonder what you guys think of this potential matchup. Or are we not going to see it, right? Is this scapegoating not going to take the form of trying to brush aside Netanyahu?
It remains to be seen. Trump is so unpredictable, and I am not quite sure what he actually wants to accomplish, and what he is fueled by. He sometimes says sober things that you don't hear from other politicians that are true, but then he's also totally, off the rails at other points. I mean, he's spoken about nuclear war quite soberly. He's talked about how we just must not have nuclear war. It would be devastation unlike anything imaginable, and we cannot have that. If that mindset had been in place, we wouldn't have a war in Ukraine, because you would have been able to game it out and seen that the only way you could really secure a victory there would be to escalate to the point that eventually Russia would have to intervene with nuclear weapons. So it was like, at least he seems to understand this rhetorically. But is he really, he got $100 million from Adelson's widow, reportedly,
Yeah.
on the condition, or a sort of soft quid pro quo of like he's going to recognize the annexation of the West Bank. But would he really do that? That would seem to be sparking a West Bank genocide, and it would put him in the same position. It's good for Trump, from Trump's perspective, not to have that genocide going on and damaging him in the way that it damaged Joe Biden. And so, does this mean you get rid of Bibi so that you don't have to really look at Zionism writ large and the larger trends? You can just personify it. So just like we do with every country we overthrow, we caricature their leader into some cartoon character that we demonize, and then anybody who tries to defend that country and say, hey, you shouldn't invade that country. What are you, a Saddam Hussein lover? And they'll make jokes about, whatever you're going to perform for Saddam Hussein sexually or something. It's always very subtle, these arguments. But so maybe they will have, if this ceasefire comes through, it seems that could lead very quickly to the end of Netanyahu's political career. Many people have said it seems that he may be headed for being prosecuted for a number of things. And so that could be really the end of his political life, his life as a free person. But that would be preferable than like actually taking stock of like, well, wait a second, what has Zionism been since its establishment? I mean, this is a dark thing. I mean, I just learned that the bodyguard of Ben Gurion was a guy named Yeshua Cohen, and he was the assassin of a great Swedish statesman named Folke Bernadette, who was in Palestine and trying to come up with a fair solution between Palestine and Israel. And the Stern gang that this guy was a part of just murders him, assassinates him, and then Ben Gurion makes him his bodyguard, and he's going around with him at diplomatic engagements and so on. It's a vicious, murderous project that I think that the world is waking up to now. I was not as candid about this, it didn't make as much sense to me until October 7th. And then it made me look back at all these things, and it made me wonder why it didn't seem more clear before how nefarious this was. And I think that the ADL, which is a Mossad cutout essentially, and all these other institutions, they manipulate the culture such that we reflexively don't want to be called anti-Semitic. But I think that's changing, and now I think to be called an anti-Semite, unless it's like you kind of expect to, if you're not being accused of being an anti-Semite when you speak about the Gaza genocide, then you're probably doing something wrong because there's a whole group of people whose job it is to lie about that. And they'll say blood libel, blood libel. How dare you say that you're saying that that we're killing children? But it's like, go look on Telegram or TikTok or anything. You see horrors that you never would have wanted to see. I mean, you can't libel somebody who actually does kill thousands and thousands and thousands of children and then brags about it. I mean, there's even that one photograph on Telegram of that IDF guy, and he's masturbating over the smoldering ruins of Gaza up on a hillside. I mean, this is sick. And so that's where we're at.
I would add too, our friend Miko Peled, if he were on the show right now, would caution us, in support of what Aaron just said, caution us to never underestimate the ability to survive politically that Benjamin Netanyahu has shown over the past 4+ decades. Just when you think this guy has been knocked off his pedestal, he comes roaring right back. I remember when he was very briefly not the prime minister of Israel, a year or two ago. And I wanted to, throw a party to celebrate. And Miko's like, no. He's coming right back.
He'll be back.
Yeah.
However,
and he was.
We are all mortal, and Bibi Netanyahu is just as mortal as we are. He's 75 years old. He's not.
I don't think I realized forever.
That. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And he's slow. I mean, he might look okay for 75, but 75 is 75.
Yeah.
Probably his expiration date is coming up. Maybe he's just going to retire.
I mean, we're all, maybe. It seems like that would be the graceful way out. I don't know that he doesn't seem like he's done that. I remain perplexed as to why people who don't need to work continue working.
Yeah,
when
I agree.
Political figures, members of
Why
Congress.
Why do we have 90-year-old senators, for example?
Yeah.
Why?
I do feel like some of it is just getting high on your own supply, right?
Yeah.
Like you like, of course, the money, you like the power, and you like the intrigue and the lifestyle. But then I think human beings also, you are susceptible to people telling you constantly that you are great and you are saving this great project. And I do think you have to have some level of, it requires a little bit of courage to question yourself regularly, as I think you have to in a position like that. And I think it's just, we have a bunch of people who lack that courage, and end up then never questioning what yes men around them are saying and staying in, being wheeled in to vote like Dianne Feinstein.
Yeah, well, I think the lifestyle is
incompetent.
probably pretty good, but the best explanation I've heard so far, and obviously there's no one single explanation, but James Carville a few months ago is just he dashed off something, as he does sometimes, that's really quite brilliant, where he's like, he remembered that after, when he got out of the game, his phone just stopped ringing. And he was like, this sucks. People normally, something would happen you get a news alert and suddenly his phone would blow up with all sorts of important people. And then but he'd get the news alert, but it'd be like the rest of us. His phone did not blow up. And he's like, that's a terrible feeling. It's hard to deal with. And when you're used to it, there's just, it's hard to give up. I believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to, before we run out of time, I wanted to get to a couple of the other things. Indulge me. I don't know. I do have some thoughts about Joe Biden's farewell speech.
Oh, please.
If you will bear with me. I mean, one, it was just, speaking of people who are hitting their expiration date, he could not get through 12 seconds without mumbling incomprehensibly.
Mm-hmm.
But what was just head spinning to me is that he makes this warning, right? So I see the headlines are that Biden gives Biden's farewell speech, his farewell warning is about a tech industrial complex, right? And a tech oligarchy taking shape in America, which is another example of American leaders and the party that's been in power for the last 4 years living in the wrong the wrong tense, you know what I mean? Is not taking shape. It has taken shape already and is exerting its influence very obviously and clearly. But I'm thinking, okay, all right, he's going to talk about oligarchs and whatever. But what his issue is, I guess, is fact checking on Facebook, right? So he warns about this dangerous tech industrial complex, which is, I think, real. But the problem is that people on YouTube were, too able to say that like cloth masks don't work or something for a couple of years. And so he says this, he bitches about disinformation, not to like poo-poo the danger that is having extremely powerful people own extremely powerful platforms, but he goes straight from this speech to talking about how great AI is, and then issuing this executive order that is not going to restrict or punish any of these multi-billion-dollar tech companies that he has been warning us about, and who are already, distorting and degrading the quality of energy supply for regular American customers, that are stealing the labor and creative output of human beings to feed their money-making machines, who are already misleading the public online with AI programs by giving them, erroneous Catholic doctrine or, bad information about airline policies or whatever. And he says, okay, this tech industrial complex that I warned you about, I'm going to give them preferential access to federal lands. I'm going to streamline permitting processes for them so they can get around some environmental assessments. I'm going to, give them tax breaks to set up these big data centers that are already distorting the energy supply systems of states, already affecting the energy quality that regular American consumers get in states. And so he's just setting up, creating more nuclear power, paving the way perhaps for fracking, for geothermal power, because we're doing that now. And so it's like, okay, you're warning us about the dangers of having community notes instead of a bunch of fact checkers on Facebook. Who gives a fuck? But now you're going to give these already wealthy companies a little extra break to make the rest of our lives worse, while, just ensuring that none of us get to watch a movie that was written by a human being ever again. The irony was so thick. You could cut it with a knife. And I was really surprised not to see anybody else say anything about this. Like, Sam Altman isn't a tech oligarch, and also OpenAI can't pay for its own land and its own data centers. It was really bizarre. So obviously, I was quite upset.
I would be remiss not in just quickly sliding in a promo for my next piece for the Wall Street Journal, which is about OpenAI unpersoned me. If you go to ChatGPT and ask, who is Ted Rall, it will not answer. If you ask, like, who wrote The Revenge of the Latchkey Kids, my most famous book, New York Times bestseller, it gives the credit to someone else.
Oh, no.
Oh, my God.
If you ask, who were the finalists for the 1996 Pulitzer Prize, I was one of 3. It gives the credit to someone else. They have unpersoned me because about a year ago, I wrote a piece critical of OpenAI for the Wall Street Journal. They have unpersoned me.
That's unbelievable.
And like, I've even tried to like retro engineer, like how, like, can I get it to admit that I exist? There is no way to get it to it. Like, are there any cartoonists whose last name rhymes with Mall? No. Yeah. Are there any cartoonists whose first name is Ted? There's 5, not me. It's actually really remarkable. It's a reminder that tech is not neutral. And like, OpenAI is now, ChatGPT is being embedded in search engines. Mm-hmm. It's being used by the Pentagon. It's being used by the IRS. I'm like thinking, well, maybe it'll tell the IRS that I don't exist, so I don't have to pay taxes.
Right.
But it's going to be everywhere. We have achieved, Winston Smith at the Ministry of Truth. We are there.
The irony, I want to hear what you guys, but I will point out also, you can't not see Google's AI generated answers, which I was just reading, take 10 times more energy to produce than the results of a regular Google search. And so again, Biden is going out, slapping himself on the back for his climate initiatives. Well, what is that against the incredible energy surge in energy consumption that you are facilitating with public support as you go out the door? It's just it's completely upside down, and I was surprised not to see more anybody highlighting it. But I guess we're just all, I don't know, focused on who can say what on Facebook or who can say what on X, which I'm not going to say it's fun to be dogpiled on a social media account, but it seems a little less important than.
I gotta say, I thought this speech was honestly just another piece of evidence that Joe Biden is senile. He's going back to when he was a little kid. He saw that very impressive speech by Eisenhower, warning of the military-industrial complex. And it's exactly the same thing. Eisenhower soaked in the military-industrial complex. He was, I mean, no one built it up faster or bigger than Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s. And then he comes out, now he's out, the door is hitting him on the ass. So he decides to like warn us about this thing that he was totally responsible for. And Joe Biden, in his senile old man way, did exactly the same thing. He was wallowing in oligarchy. He presided over the continuation of the increasing chasm in the income and wealth gap, but also he presided over the sale, one of the biggest influence peddling scandals in American history in terms of all the crap. I mean, you could argue that we went to war for Ukraine in part because of his family business with Hunter. I mean, it's insane. I mean, it's kind of like no self-awareness. And again, like at the end, I really think he was like, oh, I'm going to Ike this. And it's just like, it's because what I remember from when being a kid.
I don't know.
And Eisenhower did attempt in some ways to rein in the military-industrial complex because he recognized that it was a huge drain on the U.S. balance of payments position because of the way that the Bretton Woods regime was set up. And Kennedy, when he took over, Kennedy was obsessed with the gold position, and he was making every department report on how much they were spending and whether this was adding to the balance of payments deficit of the U.S. and the deficit of the federal government. But then, and he, I believe that this is another reason why he was pulling out of Vietnam. But once the U.S. goes into Vietnam and they waste and they blow up the dollar position so much, they basically have to get rid of the gold peg. And then you have this new system where it's just, we can make as many dollars as we want. And that's another aspect of it when you think about how we can't solve any problems. And yet we have had this situation that Dick Cheney summed it up well. He said deficits don't matter. And they didn't for several decades. But even with that, did we ever spend large amounts of money to solve social problems, to deal with things like climate change and infrastructure? Or did we put billions of dollars into researching cleaner energy, fusion that might be used for massive desalination, of seawater that would be useful in times like when LA catches on fire? I mean, we haven't. We've been completely irresponsible, and we didn't even have to be. We didn't even have to even try to like worry about the budget that much, except that I believe that the oligarchs who do run everything became convinced that if you did not have the precarity in the U.S. and the general corruption of everything being run for business and for profit, that democracy might break out. And so I think that's a part of why they don't actually, it's not even just the people that make money off of college loans or the people that make money off of healthcare or exorbitant rents, these other things that make everything really expensive and overpriced to make American labor overpriced. I think it's that they actually realize they don't want the public to have much wherewithal and economic security because then they might participate in politics more. That's what happened in the 60s. And you saw the reaction of that from like the Trilateral Commission and the Powell memo. It's reflected there on the liberal side of the equation with Sam Huntington and so on with the Trilateral Commission. And then on the right wing side, the Powell memo, Chamber of Commerce, they're all basically saying like we need to basically get people disengaged from politics and just manage this. Let the adults run everything. And what that means was they had the printing press and basically Rumpelstiltskin power to create as much money as they wanted. And they spent almost none of it to actually help any human beings. They spent way more on killing people than on helping people, and that's the legacy of the U.S. empire that will be there for any historian who, in a post-imperial world, tries to look at what happened to the U.S. They will see that we were run by people who thought like this, and this is why we're so screwed.
Mm-hmm.
All right. TikTok, anybody?
I gotta say it's becoming absurd what we're seeing with these daily developments surrounding TikTok. So the Supreme Court upheld the TikTok ban unanimously, all right, which of course everybody knew they would. But then Biden said, well, he's not going to enforce the ban for the rest of his presidency. Then why the heck did you push the ban in Congress?
It's so stupid.
I don't understand it. And then Trump says, well, we're not going to ban TikTok. Well, it's banned. It's just, do you implement it or not? Like, do these people not think more than 5 minutes into the future?
Yes.
Apparently.
I mean, I think that is some of the answer. Yeah, well, you're going to get Congress to pass another law to repeal the law that it passed to ban TikTok, and everyone go, oh, no, we decided it's not a national security issue.
Idiots.
Trump may issue an executive order. That's what people are suggesting, which if he did would be a positive thing. It would also be very, very funny. And the thing about TikTok that is really kind of infuriating is that TikTok complied with U.S. licensing regulations and everything else. They hire, there's a lot of ex-spooks and really nefarious characters that work in quality assurance and whatever.
That's right.
Protection at TikTok. The reason that TikTok was still unacceptable is will never be honestly stated by the politicians. It's that because it was a Chinese company, they couldn't do what Facebook and Twitter do, which is basically rig the entire algorithm to silence everything that they want silenced and to basically shadow ban people so that they have total control over what becomes popular, viral, and everything else. That was really the issue. They don't, and they can't even say it. They just say it's like this Chinese thing and it's not good for our national security. But it's really that they are such covertly fascist people who don't believe in a marketplace of ideas, who really want to propagandize so that they can manage things in a top-down way. And that's why they had to get rid of TikTok, because it was not going to be totally rigged in a way that would be opaque to everyone, which like these other monopolies are.
Do you remember the hearings, the TikTok hearings on Capitol Hill, where who was it? It was like Josh Hawley or Tom Cotton or something. So one of those right-wing extremists in the Senate kept pressing the CEO of TikTok to admit to some sort of ties, not further explained, to the Chinese Communist Party.
Right.
And finally, he's like, I'm not Chinese.
He was from Singapore.
He was from Singapore. He said, I'm Singaporean. I don't have any ties to the Chinese Communist Party. There are no Chinese Communist Party members who are executives at TikTok. I don't know what you want me to say. And they're like, banned. We're banning them.
I will say I never signed up for TikTok because I have a moratorium on new apps, but immediately broke that to sign up for Xiaohongshu. The little red note app, the other like actually Chinese government controlled app, just because I wanted to be part of that dagger, because those were there are a couple days of like very funny memes of Americans talking to their Chinese counterparts and learning things about themselves. It was very cute.
Excellent.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to stay on there, but I'm trying to figure it out.
Like it's part of my bedtime ritual, where, rather than just sit and watch TV all night, I'll get in bed and just put TikTok up on and just flip through videos until I'm tired enough to go to sleep. Yeah. And, I'm not going to be
now
able to
what
do
are you
that.
going to do?
No big deal. Now, oh my God, I'm going to have to go to Facebook Reels.
Yeah.
Oh, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like it's going to. I don't think TikTok's really going to shut down, but we'll see.
Yeah.
I don't either.
Trump's going to save it. He's got every advantage to do it. He'll make the Democrats look like total idiots, but I'm not sure he's going to do it. But I'd say it's like a 60-40. I'd say he'll do it, but take that for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They really just. I mean, they set him up for all of this. You know what I mean? They passed him the ball and they're letting him dunk it on TikTok, on Gaza. Like, it's incredible. And I mean, I don't think that Trump is some political mastermind. I think he just is occasionally authentic. And I think that the Democratic Party is just, they have simply lost their minds. Like they simply don't live in the same reality that most Americans do. I mean, because you know,
the people running it, keep in mind that the
yes,
party knows that their voters don't like them and what they have to offer. That's why there was no primary this year. This was remarkable.
hmm
There was they foisted a candidate on us that nobody voted for at all. Even when she ran for president before, she didn't get a single delegate, right?
Oh, and she dropped
she
out
didn't even
before
get,
Iowa. Yeah.
yeah, before Iowa. She
Yeah.
never even made it
So
to,
they
to
know
a primary.
three rigged primaries in a row, really. They
Yeah.
know they're not even popular with their own voters. That's why they know their candidates are not popular with their own voters, so they don't let them vote, or they
Yeah.
rig
I
it
just
so
say
much that it's like comical.
it's more than three. I mean, 2012, Obama ran unopposed.
Mm.
2008, they shivved John Edwards. 2004, they shivved Howard Dean. The whole
Yeah.
Dean Scream thing, it's
Yeah.
kind of a lie. It never happened, really.
Mm.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
true.
you know,
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's gotten more. I guess what I mean is the last three were more over the top, clearly like
Oh, yeah.
blatantly rigged. But yeah, I mean, I think it was the McGovern after the McGovern loss, they rigged the primaries to make it much more conservative friendly, and that was around the time of Rockefeller. The next Democrat candidate for president is handpicked by David Rockefeller, and that's
Mhm.
what happens. Watergate shifts politics to the right.
mhm.
They drop Nelson Rockefeller from the ticket in 1976. He's not on there as the VP, but it doesn't matter because the Democrats are now the Rockefellers. There's no more Rockefeller Republicans. The Democrats are
Well,
neoliberal,
didn't Nelson
pro-business
Rockefeller die?
Republicans. What's that?
I thought Nelson Rockefeller died.
He didn't. No, he was dropped from the ticket before he
Yeah.
died. He did. He
Yeah.
is dead, but he was dropped. The Halloween massacre with the same time that they basically moved the whole cabinet over to the right. They moved Dick Cheney into chief of staff. They make Rumsfeld Secretary of Defense. They fire William Colby at CIA and
Mhm.
replace him with George H.W. Bush. It was like Watergate was really a right-wing coup, and both parties shifted to the right after that. And
Yeah.
it's been the Democrats are now Rockefeller Republicans, and
Mhm.
the Republicans are to the right of that.
Mm.
Crazy.
All right, the last thing, so we don't take up too much time, unless we want to slide in the CNN defamation lawsuit in it. But I welcome, of course, Cuba being removed from the list of state sponsors of terror. Terrific. What was interesting to me in all this reporting about it is no one is saying anything about sponsoring terror or no longer sponsoring terror. You know what I mean? It was like the reporting about it reveals this to be purely cruel and purely punitive,
Yeah,
right?
like what terror? Who?
Well,
What?
I mean, they don't even, they're like, yeah, there's a deal's been struck between the Cuban government and the Catholic Church, and the Cuban government is going to release a bunch of prisoners who the United States considers to be unjustly detained or political prisoners, which is like terrific. You know, whatever. I see that there is a deal here. It doesn't have anything to do with sponsoring international terrorism, you know? And I am aware of like the justifications that the United States offered when it put Cuba on that list a few years back. You know, they're like, you know, whatever, with protecting us from Assata Shakur plotting domestic terrorism in the United States, and some garbage about like ELN members of a Colombian armed group coming there for peace talks and then staying, which is, again, like very weak sauce to begin with. But it was surprising to me that everyone sort of reports like Biden administration, they've got this prisoner deal, and so they're removing Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terror. But that's not what the list is about. It's not the list of countries that have political prisoners. And again, it's just like
They
nobody
don't.
even
They don't
even
have political
pretends.
prisoners in Cuba anyway. According to Amnesty International will say this years ago. The last time it was like they don't actually have political prisoners because the people that are in jail are people that are in jail for having worked with U.S. intelligence and stuff like that. They don't have people in there that are just like, oh, you don't like communism, you're in jail. That's just a U.S. made up thing.
It just demonstrates. I mean, this is why this is why people don't believe what people, you know, members of the government walk out and say. This is why people don't believe in American institutions, why they're like, you know, clearly don't believe in mainstream media anymore, because there's not even a pretense of trying to make this action related in any way to the thing it's supposed to be about. Do you know what I mean?
Well, maybe terrorism is good now, and so they removed Cuba from that list because, you know, we just put our
Oh, it's
guys,
good in Syria.
the jihadis in charge of Syria. So we're like
Yeah.
thinking like, wait, terrorism is good, so we've got to take them off this good list because, you know, terrorism is cool apparently.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. To me, it was just another sign that like that combined with the farewell speech, it's just and Biden trying to take credit for this ceasefire. It's just like nobody believe you're performing a show that everyone has walked away from, right? Nobody buys this.
It's
But
it's like they're insulting our intelligence. They used to work harder on the lies.
mhm.
It showed that they respected us more. They was like, all right, we're gonna really have to, pull off like like an Argo type like deception thing.
Yeah.
There's nothing. It's like here we're not even gonna try like they're terror folks doing terror things in a terrible way. By the way, what about what's gonna prevent what's with all this last minute stuff? I mean, if
Hmm.
Biden was serious about taking Cuba off this list, it should have happened years ago. And then it would have been much harder for Trump to unwind it.
Yeah.
Trump can come in next week and just erase that, and no one's going to care. It won't even make any difference to the Cubans, really. But like, if this had been a fact, and let's say there'd been American tourists going down to Havana for the last 4 years, it'd be a little bit harder for Trump. I mean, he still could. He did
Hmm.
in 2017, but Trump could take that away. But it would be tougher. I
Hmm.
mean, why even like pretend to do this at the last second?
There was another thing too. Biden said this morning that the Equal Rights Amendment has been ratified and it is now a part of the Constitution. And everybody else is like, wait a minute. No, it hasn't.
Should
So
have been.
it should have been in the 70s when it
Yeah.
was first proposed,
Should have been
but
in 1789. But yeah.
that's right. That's right. In 1789. Who knows? It's comical now, the last few days of this administration.
It used to be harder to point out the duplicity and greed and criminality of the U.S. empire, and now anybody basically can make a really damning argument against the U.S. and it's the constant lying of officials and the crimes that
Oh yeah.
are just normalized here. And that's where I think we're getting at something important, which is that the legitimacy of the U.S. is cratering, and not the Americans don't believe it. People outside of the West don't believe it. It's just basically a kind of elite, sort of managed perception of like things you're allowed to think and not think. And we just, even though nobody really believes what the regime says anymore about very important things, there isn't any other counterforce ready to supplant them because
Hmm.
everything is really about who has enough money to organize something, and everybody that's got a lot of money is invested in this particular system and has skin in the game, so to speak. So I think that the rest of the world is just going to have to kick the White West's ass.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the end of Whitey, really. I mean, I don't mean Whitey like white individuals and skin color. I just mean this project of people setting out from England and landing in America, be like, hey, nice place, and they turn into this great business place by enslaving people and murdering the population, and then going out further and selling everything that they can and so on. And this is not. This is done, I think. Like it's just a question of how is it gonna fail? Is it going to fail with a nuclear doomsday option, or is it going to be a more gradual thing? Or could the U.S. actually realize its problems and reform itself in a rational way? That's what I would hope for. The
I do
optimist
want to
that I
ask,
am.
is this that was well summed up. Is that the reason why there is, I think, a real over the top focus on speech right now? On community notes versus fact checking, which really seems like pretty, in many cases, I don't know, individual kind of things, or just sort of trivial stuff. Like, is that?
Yeah. They have to censor and manipulate and shadow ban and other things, because if the marketplace of ideas was actually to operate as a so-called free marketplace of ideas, then the establishment would be destroyed. Even with all the secrecy and how they can hide some of the details of their crimes, there's already enough out there to totally make a damning, unanswerable case against this regime. It's totally lawless. It is not democratic. It's even political science, which is methodologically gimped to a huge degree. Even Gillens and Page, I think that's the study you were referencing earlier. They
Yes.
say that the median American voter has no say on policy whatsoever. And that's obvious to more people. I didn't even vote last time. My mom worked for a congressman. I worked on political campaigns since I was like 10 years old. I worked on presidential campaigns in '04 and '08. I didn't vote because I feel like if I'm voting, and even if I'm voting for one of the three hapless leftist candidates or whatever, because they can't even unite in one
Mhm.
with under one candidate, even doing that is legitimating the idea that this is a democracy in the first place. Like I'm now, and I'm not saying that not voting is going to be any more effective than voting. I think it'll be exactly as effective, which is this is a top-down regime, and I don't want to endorse it in any way until things change, because otherwise, if I do, I feel like I'm almost implicated. Even just by voting, I'm going to be implicated in whatever crimes they commit, because this is not a democracy. And this is a covert fascist system built on global domination and the lawless pursuit of it. That's pretty straightforward, but it's true, and that sucks.
Yeah. Uh, should we leave it there, guys? Is anyone really thirsting for that CNN defamation ruling?
They lose.
Yeah, they lost. I don't know, Aaron, I didn't mention this to you, I don't think. We talked sometime previously about a defamation case brought against CNN in Florida by this military contractor, like former serviceman, who was offering for a lot of money to get his story is he was offering a professional service to professional people who could pay for it, and to like businesses to get their staff out. But CNN painted him as though he was part of some black market and trying to shake down individual Afghans. And I think they awarded him $5 million.
Yeah,
He
they
did.
did.
Yeah.
CNN's going to appeal this, of course. They're going to fight it to the bitter end. They may not let it go to the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court's jonesing for an opportunity to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan, the 1964 case that defines defamation law in this country. And this would give them the chance to do it. But CNN's definitely going to take this to the state Supreme Court and see what they can get. I mean, they have powerful, rich, smart lawyers, so they'll see what they can do. I'm very happy to see this. And the specific details of this case to me are less interesting, just then to see that there is increasing amount of pushback against media corporations that think that they can just basically say anything they want about anyone, and that they're just going to be protected under the First Amendment indefinitely. I make my living from the First Amendment, but if you're engaged in sloppy journalism and you're playing fast and loose with people's reputation without giving it a lot of thought, you deserve to be sued.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, guys, should we leave it there?
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining us, Aaron.